Hi everyone, welcome to our series of Breaking Down the Borders interviews, and it gives me a lot of pleasure this morning, to welcome Jenn Zahrt. And Jenn has not done any Borders conferences for us before, so welcome to the Borders family, Jenn.
Thank
It's
you.
getting bigger and bigger, and I'm happy to say younger and younger. I really love that. So
Awesome.
Jenn, you're based in Seattle, is that right?
I have been based in Seattle, but I just moved to Olympia, Washington about 2 months ago. So it's a bit
Right.
south of Seattle, but around that area, yes.
Are you affected by the big bushfire, or what we call bushfires, you call wildfires?
Not at the moment. A lot of them are taking place in California, but there have been fires in Washington state, but there's not happening now, thankfully.
Oh, oh, good. Thank goodness. I know there was a report the other day because normally a lot of our Australian firefighters go over there to help and vice versa. And this year they sort of put it off because of the COVID situation.
Yeah.
But then last week they sort of said, yes, we are going to send 50 fighters
Wow.
over.
Yeah.
And then at the end of only a few days ago, a few days ago, they said no, it's calmed down a little, so
Oh, okay.
we've
Yeah.
decided not to send them because by the time they got there, they'd have to go into quarantine, and
It's such a strange time right now, for sure.
very strange. Don't get me started. Uh, Jenn, I like to ask everyone because I think I love to hear the answers. When you were a little girl, what did you want to be when you grew up?
Wow. I don't think I've been asked this question in a very long time. So, my first desire was to be a doctor of medicine because my cousin had cystic fibrosis, and I thought that I would be the hero that would solve that disease. But as I got to be older, I had two things happen. One, the intervening desire to become an architect came out of me, and also
Hmm.
eventually cystic fibrosis had found some kind of cure. So I was like,
Right.
well, they don't really need me on that front line, so I'll think about architecture. And then in the course of wanting to be an architect, I learned that architecture is actually very boring. And then by the time I hit 15, I learned about astrology and how astrology wasn't allowed to be taught in school because it wasn't academic enough. And then I
Hmm.
began my complete crusade as an astrologer because I thought, how is this archive of human knowledge exiled from education, public education worldwide, just because
Right.
they consider it not to be actual knowledge? Well, who decides that, right? And so that became my passion, actually. So by the time I was 15, I actually knew I wanted to be an academic astrologer.
Wow, that's young.
So,
That
yeah.
is young.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
was really mad when I found out that astrology was not able to be taught in school. And I love school. I have everything in the ninth house, right? So I'm just like all about school, third house, ninth house axis. And then they were like, "Well, you can't learn this." And I'm like, "Don't tell me what I can't do. I want to learn astrology, and I want people in school to learn about it too. Like, how can you keep this from people?" So that's been a massive driver. And so yeah, ever since 15, I actually wanted to be an astrologer.
So basically, on your Saturn opposition, on your
Yeah.
first Saturn opposition, that's when you started so how did you discover it?
Well, I was grounded. I disobeyed my parents and they
Right.
took away my computer and they said I couldn't see my friends and I was very, very sad. I had Saturn on my moon at that point. And so I went to my German teacher who was my favorite person and I said, I've grounded for 6 months. It's the worst thing ever. And he's like, when were you born? What time and where? And I'm like, why do you want to know that? And so then the next day he says, "Oh, in 6 months you'll be fine." And I'm like, "What? What do you mean? Like, this is the worst thing that's ever happened to me." And he said, "Can you go to Powell's Books in Portland, Oregon?" Because I went to high school around Portland, Oregon. And he goes, "Go to Powell's Books." And I said, "Actually, ironically, that is the one place that I can go." And he said, "Okay, look at these books." And so he listed out the Ephemeris, the Atlas, the Book of Tables,
Wow.
which was the Koch House of Tables. So I learned Koch houses first. And then he said, get Alan Oken's Complete Book of Astrology. And if you have any questions, let me know after school before your mom picks you up. And then we spent the next 6 months after school talking about astrology, and he taught me everything. And he
Wow.
basically, downloaded all of this information. And I had no idea until about actually 5 years ago that I'm the only student in his entire high school teaching career that he ever taught astrology to. I
That's
thought this was
fabulous.
something that just happened, and like, oh, I'm just one of
Yeah.
many people. He's just, transmitted astrology. And he's like, no, you're the only person. And I was like, oh, wow, thanks.
That's an amazing story. That's one of the good ones. I've
I,
heard some interesting ones, like someone who wanted to be a train engine, but I think yours is even better. He didn't want to be the train driver. He wanted to be the train engine.
oh, wow. How do you do that?
I thought that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
But yeah, I told you I get a lot of interesting answers when I ask people that question.
Yeah. Well, the weird thing was actually in that moment when he was teaching me about the history of astrology and actually mundane astrology was his specialty. So I was learning about that as a first time young astrologer, which is a little awkward if you think about it. Like, how are you learning about the astrology of nation states before you learn how to interpret a natal chart?
Yeah.
But he pointed me to the work of Nick Campion, another mundane astrologer. And so I noticed that Nick had written the history of British astrology pretty much at that point in the 1999 area. And so I was like, you know what? Yeah, and I was like, I'll be the German version of Nick Campion. So I said this is literally what I thought. I was like, I will become fluent in German and I will look at the German texts and then I will like do what Nick did, but I'll do it in German. And then later in my work, I actually do work with Nick right now at the Sophia Center Press. And I told Nick the moment that I sat with Patrick Curry, the other major historian of British astrology, and Nick Campion, just the three of us at this table outside of one of the astrology meetings in London. And I just said, I'm really glad neither of you speak German so that I can be like the German version of what you've done for the astrology community. And I just loved that I got a chance to actually say it to their faces and like own it and show up for it. It just felt really great, as a life achievement. So.
But you didn't do it, did you?
I'm doing it now.
Oh, you're in the process of doing it. Oh, great. Yeah, so well done.
I'm currently a postgraduate fellow at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David, and my project is translating German texts into English and then teaching about the German perspective on astrology in the early 20th century. So in my master's thesis that I finished at the Sophia Center in the University of Wales revolved around the ways that Germans tried to legitimize the practice of astrology in the 20th century. Right. Because a lot of the topics they were talking about, we're still wrangling with them in the English speaking world right now. And I'm like, this conversation's 100 years old. We've been having it for so long.
Oh God, yes. Yeah. No, it's interesting that I know I set out at one stage to do a big book of Australian charts. But this was in pre-computer days, and I just found it so difficult. In the end, I gave up. Yeah. Maybe I should put that as add it to my list of projects for when I retire.
There you go. Yeah.
Which I've got so many now that there's no way any of them will get,
I'm sure.
One at a time,
I know.
So your PhD is from the University of Wales?
No, my PhD is from the University of California, Berkeley, and I got it in German language, but my thesis is about the astrological imagination in early 20th century Germany. So I realized actually that to integrate astrology into the academy, if you go through the foreign language angle, they're talking about culture and fiction. Their whole point is fiction, right? It's like, oh, German literature, right? What is that? But just made up stuff. And I'm like, well, if astrology is made up according to like standardized knowledge, I can talk about astrology in a department that's all about fiction. Because if they're like, well, is it true? I'm like, well, is all the other stuff on the syllabus true? Because it's not. So let's talk about astrology. And they couldn't say no, basically. That's how I got it through.
Do you have an ethnic background in German, or is it just like you do? So your parents or
I really just loved learning German. In my earlier education, they had a class where they taught you a little bit of Spanish, a little bit of French, and a little bit of German. And I couldn't understand any of the Spanish or French, but the minute that the German hit, it was like my ancestors woke up and they're like, bing, and I just could do it. No one else in class could do any of it. They loved the Spanish and the French. And then they're like, what's wrong with Jen? She's like really good at German. And I'm just like, I just get it. It's weird. And even
I actually understand that. I love listening to French and I love listening to Spanish and Italian, but I actually got expelled from my French class.
I love
but they're very musical languages, whereas the Germanic languages are far more like English. They're far more guttural, and I can relate to that more. too.
Yeah.
So I do understand exactly where you're coming from. I can't speak German.
Yeah.
I mean, my people come from Hungary, and both my parents could speak very fluent German.
Mm.
And you know, so I sort of heard quite a bit of it around. I mean, nobody speaks
Yeah.
Hungarian. The only people who
Yeah.
speak Hungarian are Hungarians.
There you go.
But you know, German was a common language. I mean, they talk about French being the common language, but I found that more often it's German or Spanish.
Yeah.
Those two seem to be the two. You know, apart from the diplomatic and the Olympic languages, it's, you know.
Hmm. Well, the
Um,
logic inside the language, you say everything you see, and with French,
yeah,
it's like there's a bunch of stuff there, and you're like, what am I allowed to say? What isn't pronounced? What's going on? I just had no way of seeing anything. And
yeah,
with German, it's very clear, and the logic also behind how you construct sentences and the way that you
yeah.
can build like amazing words out of multiple nouns and adjectives. Like I just loved that logic. So it
Yeah,
just
yeah, yeah. It's very German, isn't it? You
yeah.
know,
Oh,
the language. If you can, that logic and that
yeah.
you know, down to
And
earthness, down to
58
earth.
letter words, like Sicherheitstemperaturbegrenzung. Like, what is that? It's a
Yeah,
safety temperature valve. Like, that's
yeah.
awesome. It's one word.
Yeah, and I think you know, there's so much English comes from German. So many English words come from
Yeah,
German. So
that did also help
um,
make it easier for me.
it does, it does. So so how did you get started in your actual astrology career then?
So I had to be in the closet for a long time because as an academic at Berkeley, I was allowed to study it from an outsider perspective, but I wasn't really allowed to be fully embodied as a professional. But when
Yeah.
I had my Saturn return, UAC 2012 was taking place, so that dates me. Yes, I'm that old. And so basically came out then at 2012. And I started, I mean, I had already had longstanding relationships with the people behind Kepler College because my first astrology teacher designed the curriculum there. And so it was kind of strange to be this 30-something astrologer, but I knew all of the 60-something astrologers, and a lot of my 30-something friends had no idea who they were. So it was like this weird, like reverse generation gap bridge thing going on. And then one of my colleagues had said, just start reading, just start doing consults because
Yeah.
you've been doing this now for so long, since you were 15. It's like, it's been a half Saturn cycle, just go for it. And I thought to myself, yeah, but let me just get the PhD first and then I'll try it, right? And so
Yeah.
then it began the slow, steady sort of reveal. And so one thing that helped me go over the edge with that was I got some extra training from Rod Susskind in South Africa. He has
Uh-huh.
yeah, I met him through the University of Wales program. We were students there together, and he had a traditional based program in his school of astrology. And so I thought I need a little more Saturnian grounding in my practice before I think I can be ready for a consult, space. So I did
Yeah.
3 years with him in his school, and once I was complete with that, I felt more confident in going out into calling myself a professional counseling astrologer. But I do actually have a little bit of a beef the way that people talk about what means a professional astrologer, because sometimes people think that means that you read charts for pay for people. And because of my work with mundane astrology from the get-go, and also the fact that one of my favorite astrologers ever, like I said, Nick Campion, Nick hasn't read a personal chart for people since 1984, but he has 2 Regulus awards. And that's,
Yeah.
he's a professional astrologer, but he doesn't see clients, right? And so I think there's a conflation of, needing to see clients and then professional astrologer. And I don't think that that's fair to a lot of the astrologers in this community who don't necessarily see clients, but they're professional, and they do professional level research and writing and sort of, all these things that are still encompassed in what furthers our art.
I have been in astrology for 40 years or more, and that dates me.
Yeah.
That particular little argument and debate has been going on all that time.
Yeah.
And yeah, I just did some work with Frank Clifford, and
Love
poor
Frank.
man, he wanted me to talk about one thing, and I talked mainly about being a professional astrologer.
Yeah.
Um, and I mean, yes, of course, professional means when you make your living from astrology, of course it does, but there's also a professionalism in terms of attitude and in terms of approach,
Hmm.
and you don't always see that in so-called professional astrologers. You know, sometimes the attitudes are totally unprofessional.
Yeah.
And it is, you know, it's not one thing, and it's like, I remember years ago in England, I don't know if you heard of Derek and Julia Parker, who wrote one of the most complex, you know, biggest coffee table books ever sold. And they got banned from their professional association because they were sun sign astrologers.
Yeah.
Now, that didn't make them any less professional. You might not have agreed necessarily with what they did,
Yeah.
but they know their astrology, and they had a professional attitude towards it, and they made their living from it.
Yeah. They probably made more of a living from it than many people who consider themselves professional.
Do. Absolutely. I mean, I wrote a sun sign column for 17 years, and I mean, it's thanks to that I can actually exist now. You know,
Yeah.
it's
Well, I mean,
yeah,
that's another, that goes down to a question of, you know, how did astrology as a subject respond to the development of mass capitalist culture, right? That's a question that drives my research, actually, sometimes, is that we had this elite practice that was very much taken up with royalty and sort of higher level pursuits that would now be sort of called privileged, right? And then we had this development of a mass culture that gave rise to sun sign astrology as a phenomenon. And so, you know, it exists, so you can't say it's not real astrology. It is real astrology, but it's responding to a social construction. And
exactly.
I think we lose sight of that. Then we sort of, you know, ignore that social construction.
That is another debate, of course, and I know you do a mix of modern and classical, or what I call classical, and that's another debate that we're having as astrologers, is that, and I must admit I do have a bias in that, to me, astrology has to evolve with society, because astrology is about humanity. You can apply it to all sorts of other, well, my astrology is, I do psychological astrology, so, you know, or humanistic astrology. So it applies to humanity. So it has to evolve along with society. But then too, there is that whole, the other side of that debate, or alongside that, and this is one of the problems I always had with students, you know, when we talked about counseling, being a professional astrologer in terms of that is your work.
Yeah.
You know, just when you'd say, well, they'd say, oh, but you shouldn't charge for something, you know, so gorgeous and esoteric as astrology. And I say, yeah, try and explain that to the telephone company when your bill comes due. It, you know, they don't take that into account.
Yeah.
And it's difficult, and you know, how much freebie work should you do? How much should you charge? How much time do you put in? And these are all very practical, realistic questions which somebody who's studying business practices or accountancy have no problem with.
Yeah.
But we do, because we have that streak, if you like, of altruism and idealism, and it has to be balanced.
But I do wonder how much of that is a modern Western phenomenon and not necessarily a phenomenon you'd find in more traditional cultures. For example, like in the South African culture that Rod comes from, no one would ever ask a Sangoma, who's effectively a shaman, to do anything for free. They always come with some type of sacrifice, whether it's money or a chicken or a goat. And depending on the level of work that needs to be done, you're going to pay 3 chickens or 1 goat or 2 goats or 4 cows, you know, whatever that is. And so when it comes to pricing my work, I think to myself, okay, what am I offering as a service to this person, and how many animals do they need to bring to me? And then what's the monetary value of the animal? And that sets my prices, basically, because it's sort of like this, you want to peer behind the future? That's a thing you don't get to do without sacrifice. Anybody who gets to see the future without sacrifice runs into problems. We see this in world literature all the time. You get that intel and you haven't actually paid the sacrifice, you're going to have a really bad outcome in that story. But if you provide the right sacrifice to the oracle, you're going to have a good outcome, you know? And so that actually requires to have payment of some kind. Whether it's an actual chicken or an actual like $25 situation, that's honestly dependent upon you. If a barter is better, that's fine. But no sacrifice at all, I do have some problems with that, you know.
You're absolutely, I love the way you put that. Thank you. I'm stealing it.
Good. Take it away.
When you think about it, I mean, you go right back, you know, the 3,000, 4,000 years, people sacrificed to the gods all the time.
Yep.
And really, what we do when people charge for services, it's no different. It's really, that's exactly what it is in a modern context. And I'd never thought of it that way.
Yeah.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yeah,
See,
that's
this
what we
is why I
do.
love doing interviews. I learn something from nearly everyone, which is great. And of course, you never stop learning. I mean, that is another thing that people have to realize. As I said, I've been doing this for 40 odd years. And I still, every now and then, I'll talk to somebody about something and suddenly I'll think, oh my goodness, look at that. I never realized that.
And you know what's even crazier is when that happens about your own chart. So even after looking at my chart for 22 years, a friend of mine looked at it and she said, oh, you know, did you notice that da-da-da? And I was like, oh, I've been staring at this picture for 22 years and I never noticed that. And she goes, oh yeah, it's just right there. I was like, oh my gosh, you know, like it never ends.
I did that exactly this week. I was talking to a friend about my children, my two kids, and it suddenly dawned on me that the two planets that sort of are right at the top of my chart, and I've got about 4 ruling planets, you know, that are really, really strong. But two of the
Come on, Gemini, pick one.
Well, Mercury is one.
There you go.
But Jupiter sits right up there at the top, and so does the Sun, and they are conjunct. And it suddenly dawned on me that my daughter has Leo rising and my son has Sagittarius rising. And I mean, I've been looking at those charts for 50 odd years, and that had never dawned on me.
Yeah.
And it just hit me like that, you know.
And you know what else is awesome? I love the link of the top of the chart with motherhood also, because I think that gets overlooked a lot, to be honest, because
Absolutely.
I had some traditional friends, you know, sort of friends, make some dire predictions when I had some activity happening around my 10th house, thinking that it was going to be a professional snafu or some kind of crazy professional blah, and like, watch Jen, wait for it, you know? And then what ended up happening was an amazing healing moment with my mom. And that's all it was. It was never, it had nothing to do with professional anything. It was literally a very private, familial healing connection to my mother.
Yeah. No, so, I think that is very strong, and I'm disappointed if younger astrologers these days don't use that 4th, 10th axis, you know, parental axis. So anyway, we should talk about your lecture, because otherwise we're going to be here for a couple of hours. And I have to ask you, how is your motherhood going? How's your baby?
She's awesome. She is so ferocious. It's amazing. But, you know, she was born early. She was born 5 weeks early. So we spent some time in the NICU. And obviously, as an astrologer, I was like, I want to know her chart. And then they were like, you need to give birth today or you're going to die. So I was like, okay, can we do it so she has Aquarius rising? And they're like, sure. And I'm like, okay, cool. At least I had like one thing. And there we were in surgery. I was having a C-section, and you know, I had a reaction to the anesthetic, so they had to delay, and then a doctor didn't come in on time, so they had to delay, and then boom, she took her first breath when 0 Pisces was on the ascendant. And I was like, no.
Yeah,
but it's actually amazing.
I was talking about this to a friend who's giving birth to a Scorpio at the moment, and she wants to try and manipulate it so that the baby's a Libra. I said, forget it. I said, that baby's going to do what it wants. And my eldest granddaughter, of course, my first one, and a huge excitement. So I went along, and Scorpio is one of our family energies. It just comes through for everybody. And she was due on the 22nd. No, she was due on the 20th, I think, something like that. So I went along and had a little medallion, bought a little medallion, a Scorpio, a Libra medallion. And, or is it the other way around? Yeah, no, it was a Scorpio one, I think. Yeah, it doesn't matter. Anyway, I mean, that was 22 years ago now. So I had it there, and I was going to have it engraved with her time of birth as well as her date of birth, because people forget. And her day came. She was up there, and I'm watching the sun move, and it was about to change sign, and I thought, oh my God, you know, and I've got this Scorpio. That's right, it was Scorpio Sag. And I thought, she's going to be a Sag. And I thought, what, I have to go. And I raced back to the jeweler, and I said, look, I bought this. And I said,
no.
I don't know what she's going to be. I said, she could be either. And they just laughed and said, well, bring it back. She ended up being a Scorpio by 20 minutes.
There you go. Amazing. And you know, it's funny because my daughter's cousin is born the day before her and she's a Sag at 29, right? So I got
Yeah.
this hyper dialed in kid, you know, she's super cool. She's just so cool to be a parent. I'm really glad you
Yeah.
know, we made it
Did you,
through. And it was,
I have to ask you this though. Did you find that you know, the last 6 months, because you know, she's about 6 months old now, isn't she? She's
she's 8 months, yeah.
8 months. Did you find that, especially in that first 6 months, did you find that could you keep up with your astrology during that time?
Yes, I was able to, and you know, I front loaded my work a little bit, but I also got sick in September of last year. So about actually a year ago today, I started bleeding, and I had a life-threatening condition. Anyway, we don't need to talk about the details of it, but I was pretty much on lockdown from September until December. And
Yeah,
then she was born because there was a medical crisis. And so
yeah,
it was sort of like, you know, with the Saturn Pluto conjunction, which I have in my natal chart, and now my daughter also has in her natal chart, it was like we were living that together. And
yeah,
in a weird way, I had no idea the world was about to join us. You know, like the
yeah.
whole world was going to shut down and let us recover from this extreme trauma that we both endured. So I feel like there's a really neat kind of synergy of like, okay, well, I've been shut down for a year now, honestly. And
Yeah.
so remote teaching was good. My students and my clients were very understanding when I had to reschedule things because of my hospitalizations, and I didn't
Yeah.
talk about it very publicly because it's very kind of embarrassing to be
Well, it's
hospitalized. And,
private. I mean, it's
you
nothing to
know,
do with anybody. I mean, you know,
yeah,
that's it's a very personal thing.
yeah.
Yeah, yeah,
But the people who work with me directly are happy that we're all alive and good, and you know, it's that part of that life is over, and the conjunction happened, and we're all still here, so it's good.
yeah, yeah,
And you know, even it was weird too. Honestly, I was in Hamburg in 2015, meeting with some astrologers, and one elder astrologer in the group saw my secondary progressions, and they said, "Oh, 2019. Okay." And I was like, I don't know if anything can get any worse than it is right now, because a lot of stuff happened when Uranus was in Aries in my chart. You know, I've got a stellium in Libra, so there's that. And so I was like, I don't know what else could be worse than what's happening now. And then thinking about it after my daughter was born, I'm like, oh, now I know. Like that was
yeah.
like a real thing, you know? And that
Look,
prediction wasn't,
that's one of the things that I love about my personal astrology is I never try to look to, you know, into my chart and say, okay, this is what's coming up, this is what's
yeah,
coming up. In fact, I looked at it yesterday for the first time in I don't know how long.
yeah,
Um, but you know, and I do see, even when I do see things, I tend to say, oh, okay, and just keep doing what I'm doing. But
yeah.
then things happen, and I think, ah, that's what that was talking
Yeah,
about.
I mean, I usually look at it in 2020, right? Like I wasn't even thinking about, oh, that astrologer predicted in 2019 I was going to have a thing, but it was more like once I had survived it, I was like, oh yeah, I was given a warning. You know, someone
Yeah,
did actually say this is going to be
yeah,
a tough time,
absolutely,
and I didn't want to
absolutely.
believe it because I mean, I was just like, whatever, we'll make it through.
Well, you're cardinal. You're very cardinal, like I am, and we do our
Yeah,
own thing. We say, right, okay, fine, and you just get on with it and go ahead
exactly.
with what you're doing. Anyway,
Astrology's
let's talk about your lecture. Hmm?
okay. So one thing that I really love about part of astrology I learned in the course of my education was something that Robert Blaschke called holographic transits. And what this is a really interesting relationship between planets and each other that creates an
Mhm.
arc distance, right? So let's imagine, for example, that we have a planet that is at 0 Aries and another planet that's at 0 Gemini. There's 60 degrees separating those two. And
Mhm.
those two exact planets, let's say the moon's at 0 Aries and Mercury's at 0 Gemini, right?
Mhm.
So if we have the 60-degree separation in any other sign, that's still a pattern return, right? Because the Mercury's on the same side as the moon at a certain
Mhm.
point, right? And so there's kind of a dialed in effect that happens. And so it's kind of like a key in a lock, and the key changes the little bars of the lock so you unlock something and the transmission comes through. And so these pattern returns, instead of, you know, everybody talks about Saturn return, right? And so we got this idea of the planet is coming back to its zodiacal degree. But what I'm thinking about with this lecture is looking at when people have pattern returns, right? So for example,
Right.
um, you know, two women, best friends, both have Mars 60 degrees away from the sun and Venus 8 degrees away from the sun on the same side as the sun, correct?
Yeah.
And so when you see these people, the sign relationship would not be synastry in any book. You would never read a book about synastry saying that this sign and that sign would get along. But when you see the pattern of the arc distance, you can actually understand how they are a lock and key, and they fit together, and they are inseparable friends, right? It's a very vague example, but the idea is to focus on the arc distance between the planets and not the sign.
That's very interesting. I'm learning a lot from you. I think we'll just turn the recording off and I'll just keep talking to you until baby wakes up.
There you go. But yeah, it's going to be teaching all about these, learning how to see the arc distance relationships and understanding. It's effectively actually kind of understanding not only synastry in terms of how you might relate to another person and uncode, for example, why sometimes a chart looks like you're like, how do these people get along? And you don't see any sign-based reason why or aspect-based reason why. But if you check out the arc distance between the planets in both charts, you're going to probably see some resonance there. And resonance is kind of another key word for this in a sense, because you have, you know, in terms of the sun relationship to every other planet, it's called a synodic cycle. A synod means coming together. And so this idea that, you know, you're going to have a synodic relationship with Venus, Mars, Mercury. Every single planet has one with the sun. We know it most familiar with, oh, full moon charts tend to get along better. New moon charts get along with other new moons, right? And so this idea that then you can do that with every point according to every other point. It doesn't have to just be with the sun. So.
I did something like this many years ago, maybe 30 years ago. We're looking at how, you know, two people with cardinal T-squares will get along quite well. Yeah. Because there's that echo of understanding there. Those dings are coming from my phone and my computer and God knows where.
Fine. It's fine.
You can't stop them.
No.
Excuse me. So the lecture's called The Magic of Pattern Returns.
Yes.
And you're actually one of the last speakers for the conference. So I think that's very exciting. I'd like to go out on a bang.
Thanks. I mean, and my last name is Z, so there's also that.
Yeah, there we go. There's
that might even be why. I know, right? I'm used to it.
My maiden name was a W, and I always used to hate the fact that I was right at the end of the alphabet, but you're even worse than me.
Oh, but you know what? I get mad when there's people like Zillwiger and it's ZYW, whatever. I'm like, excuse me, I worked hard to get in the back of the line. But I'm a ZA, so I'm always the first of the Z's, you know.
Yeah. Oh, how funny. Yeah. So you're speaking on Sunday the 8th at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, which is a good time for you, and it's a great time for me too, I think. But it's
you'll be awake. Everyone in Oz can come.
I hope so. So that'll be good. Yeah, we can come. That's a good timing for us. So is there anything else you'd like to add, Jen? Anything you want to? No?
Not necessarily, no. I'm just teaching, seeing clients. You can find everything at celestialspark.com, or my school is called the Catapult Zone, so catapult.zone. Yeah. And I'm teaching a synastry class this Libra season, you know, because the Mars is retrograding through Aries. So I'm like, why don't we counterbalance that with some focus on relationships, right? So it'll be a 9-week course on synastry.
Oh, that sounds good. And you know, thank you so much. Thank you for the lesson, because I found that really interesting. And certainly your lecture is one that I'm going to look forward to, because I think that is adding, you know, I do a lot of relationship work, and that is adding that extra little bit. Well, it's not a little bit, it's a major bit, but I mean, it's extending a thought that I had but hadn't extended it quite that far. So
wonderful.
I do appreciate that. So thank you so much for your time, and I'm looking forward to talking to you again. I hope you will visit the foyer when the conference is on in November, and have a chat to people.
Absolutely. Yeah, and thank you so much for inviting me to take part. I'm really excited to
welcome to the family.
Break down the borders.
So thanks again. We'll see you again soon.
Okay.
Bye.